All right, here's the content for Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 3 and the first verse of chapter 4 connect the two chapters together. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, Adam names Eve, saying she will become the mother of all the living. And then, following the expulsion from the garden, we are told of the birth of Cain. The next son to be born is Abel. But both Cain and Abel bring offerings to God, but Abel's offering is deemed acceptable while Cain's is not. There are two main lines of thought on why Cain's offering was not accepted and Abel's was. The first is that Abel's offering involved blood sacrifice while Cain's did not. The second possibility is that Abel offered God his best while Cain only offered some of the fruits of his labor. I think that's a better suggestion. We are told um, in the passage that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil, while Abel brought some of the firstborn, which is the best of the crop. And these two offerings are contrasted with each other. So while Abel brought some of the firstborn, um, Cain just brought some of the grain and not necessarily the first fruits of the grain. Um, God sees the heart, and so the difference in the two offerings was likely not as significant as the attitude in which they were given. If later regulations regarding offerings are to be used, then these offerings both would have been acceptable under the Mosaic law. So it's probably not that it was a blood sacrifice, although that is a common interpretation. So God is aware of Cain's feelings and tries to mediate his anger by saying that his offering will be accepted if he does what is right. The, the assumption, of course, is that Cain knew what the right thing to do was, but was just unwilling to do it. The response of Cain is telling. Rather than focusing on himself and how he could do better, he resented his brother and went even further. He lured him out into a field and killed him. God questions Cain in a way that's very similar to God's earlier questioning of his parents. But this time, rather than placing the blame on others, he denies any responsibility and outright lies to God. God, of course, already knows what has happened as the ground cries out on account of Abel's blood. The response of God is again similar to Adam. But for Cain, the land will no longer yield its crop for him at all, and he will be forced to wander the earth. He will be forced from the land, the sign of blessing, and anyone who finds him will kill him. Notice that there is much left out in this story. Who is going to kill Cain? So far, we have only been told of him and his brother. Genesis is highlighting key aspects of the early history of man, not the whole story. So God protects Cain by a mark. What that mark is not known or even mentioned, and there's no way of knowing, although some have conjectured that it was everything from a badge of a dog, as in unclean, to a horn sticking out of his head. So let's leave conjecture aside here. As Adam and Eve were driven out of God's presence in the garden, so Cain is driven even further away from God to the east. Cain now lays with his wife, and again, where she comes from is not explicitly stated. She gives birth to a son and names him Enoch. There are interesting stories here of how various traits start, but the genealogy itself ends with the story of Lamech, which seems to suggest a sliding of deeper and deeper into sin. In contrast with Cain's line, there is the line of Seth that ends with the phrase, "At this time, people began to call on the name of the Lord." This highlights the line of the people of the promise, and as will be frequently seen in Genesis, it's not the line of the oldest, but the younger God chooses. One other thing to know, and that is that while Eve used the term man at the birth of Cain, when with Seth she uses the term seed, which may be referring back to the curse of the serpent being broken by the woman's seed. So that's just a quick overview of Genesis chapter 4, and hopefully we'll see some of you at Bible study.